Okay, welcome back everyone, and we'll continue with our introduction to the plant kingdom. So we'll go with the traditional classification system and group plants as either a bryophyte or a tracheophyte. Now, one thing that will be very helpful for you as we go through this unit is to learn some of the prefixes and suffixes, because this part is a little bit vocabulary rich. So the root word phyte in biology means plant. So P-H-Y-T-E, that means plant. So we have two types of plants, bryophytes and tracheophytes. Well, I like to think of these as tracheophytes as the plants with plumbing and these as the plants without plumbing. So what do we mean by that? So tracheophytes have tubes. And this should be easy for you to remember because you might know that your windpipe is called the trachea. So your trachea is the tube that runs down your throat. It's your windpipe. So this literally means tube plants. And this literally means moss plants. So that will be helpful in remembering what goes in this group. So again, I like to think of tracheophytes as plants with plumbing, with tubes running up and down, bryophytes with no plumbing. But the official way scientists refer to these plants as these are vascular plants. They have tubes. These are non-vascular plants. They don't have tubes. Now, do any of you remember from 4th grade or from high school what we call these tubes that run down up and down tracheophytes? What do we call plant tubes? Well, these would be the xylem and the phloem. So the xylem are the tubes that carry water and dissolved minerals from the roots up the stems up to the leaves. So the xylem are the up tubes. They carry water and dissolved minerals up to the leaves. Phloem, you can think of things phloem down, all right? So the phloem carries dissolved sugar, which is made in the leaves down to the roots. Now you might say, well, what about these plants? They do not have plumbing, and we'll talk about that disadvantage or how they overcome that in a little bit. So what are bryophytes? Well, when you hear the word bryophyte, I just want you to think moss, all right? Bryophytes include mosses, hornworts, and liverworts, but honestly, when I take you out for the field trip, I doubt any of you will say, oh, look, there's a hornwort, or oh, there's a liverwort. Hopefully some of you will be able to identify moss, and if you can't before the field trip, hopefully you will after. So the moral of the story is when you hear the term bryophyte, I want you to think moss, 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 moss. And again, this literally means moss plants. All right, let's look at some pictures. So we're on bryophytes. Again, these are the plants without plumbing, without xylem and phloem. So the dominant members are the mosses, and we will look at hopefully lots of examples of mosses on our field trip. And bryophytes also include the liverworts and the hornworts. Again, I doubt that most of you would run around and say, oh, look at that hornwort, but maybe we'll find a few. All right, there's this little rule in biology that says, and I didn't make this up, I just teach it, okay, that if you do not have xylem and phloem, if you do not have plumbing, you do not have true root, stems, and leaves. I did not make it up. So on the mosses, when we look at their life cycle, technically we're not allowed to call these things leaves. We have to call them leaflets. Again, I didn't make up the rules, I just teach it. All right. And the mosses, they grow very low to the ground, and they were important because these plants were the first to colonize the land, the mosses. So they're very small, and they were the pioneer plants. All right, so again, when you hear the word bryophyte, I just want you to think moss. But the dominant type of plant are the tracheophytes because the plumbing offers several advantages. So now we're going to subdivide tracheophytes into seedless plants and seed plants. Now again, I hate to define things by the negative. So when you hear the word seedless tracheophytes, seedless vascular plants, this is what I want you to think. Instead of thinking seedless, I want you to think of spores. Now, mushrooms have spores, but they're not plants. Can you think of any plants that have spores? All right, hopefully you are thinking ferns. All right. Now, technically, as we'll see in a minute, all plants make spores, but for most plants, the spores are not really visible to humans. But with ferns, they are clearly visible. So just like with bryophytes, I want you to, whenever you hear the word bryophyte, I want you to think moss. Whenever you hear seedless plant or a dominant spore plant, I want you to think ferns. All right, so hopefully you all are familiar with fern. All right, so they do have true leaves. All right, this whole frond of a fern is considered the leaf. Now, where are their spores? Well, you might know if you've gone walking through the woods or if you have a pet fern at home. If you look on the underside of the fern, all right, if you look under the underside of their leaf, you see all these little spore cases. So what you see here are not individual spores, but are actually clusters of spore cases. And you can sort of zoom up on one of these. So this is not a spore, it's a cluster of spore cases. And even here, this is sort of a magnified view. There's a cluster of spore cases, and each case is filled with gazillions of spores. All right, so those are ferns. Now, when you work through your study guide on this unit, I have 2 thought questions I want you to think about. And the question is, how are ferns and their kin, their kind, related to both global cooling and global warming? So think about that, and if you're not sure what the answer is, we can discuss it in chat or in person when we meet in person. But we're going to continue along here. All right, so we've divided plants into 2 main groups, bryophytes and tracheophytes. Remember, tube plants, no tubes. And whenever you hear bryophytes, I want you to think what? Yes, moss. Tracheophytes are divided into seedless tracheophytes, seedless vascular plants, and seed plants. Again, when you hear seedless tracheophytes, think visible dominant spores, and think of ferns. Now the seed plants we're going to divide into gymnosperms and angiosperms. The gymnosperm, as we'll see later, this means naked seed plant, and angio, these are flowering plants. But we'll talk about gymnosperms first. When you hear the word gymnosperm, I want you to think of conifers and ginkgos. Now, when you hear the word conifer, do you think of pine trees, things like that, things like Christmas trees? Yeah, so when you hear gymnosperms, think Christmas trees. Now, ginkgos. If you were on UD's campus, you should be familiar with ginkgos. They line Stewart Street. And ginkgos are pretty funky because some of the trees are male and some of the trees are female. And if you want to have one in your yard, you definitely want the male tree, because the female tree produces this yellowish, greenish, fruitish type structure, and it stinks to high heavens. I mean, if you're walking to campus on Stewart Street in the spring and these fruits drop to the ground, you squish them, they just stink like crazy. Now, of course, the male, we have a male ginkgo in our yard, and they, for reasons we'll discuss later, they just make gobs and gobs and gobs of pollen. I mean, I'm recording this in the spring, and our driveway is just littered with these huge, huge pollen structures all over our driveway. So let's just take a look at some pictures. So the ginkgo has this fan-shaped leaf that is very distinctive. All right, so maybe now you know what a ginkgo tree is. All right, and then you're familiar, there's all sorts of different pine trees and all sorts of different conifers, like redwood trees. A lot of our paper comes from conifers, etc., etc. All right, now the angiosperms are the flowering plant, and for reasons we'll discuss later, these are the dominant plants alive on the planet today. These are the most successful groups of plants. Most plants are definitely angiosperms or flowering plants. And angiosperms are subdivided, once again, into 2 groups, the monocots and the dicots. And out of these 2 groups, the dicots are dominant today. And one of the easiest ways to tell the difference between a monocot and a dicot is to look at a leaf. If you look at a blade of grass, the veins run parallel, and that's, yeah, you know I'm not a good artist. All right, so that's a characteristic of a leaf of a monocot. And if you look at, let's say, a maple leaf, and you know I'm a terrible artist, right? If you look at a maple leaf, the veins are branching, all right? And that's a characteristic of a dicot. There's lots and lots of differences between monocots and dicots. So out of all the plant diversity, angiosperms are the most successful, the most group of plants. And remember, they are the flowering plants. and they, again, have been the most evolutionary successful on our planet. So let's do some big picture check. I have seed lecture guide. So the first question is, which plants were the original colonizers of the land? So do you remember that? They were the bryophytes, the mosses, all right? So again, all the rock was barren, and that's why actually at the beginning of this module I picked that picture of the moss, because you had all barren rock until the mosses started, here we go, growing on the rock and colonizing it. So the moss and together with fungi were the first organisms to really colonize the land. And then the animals were able to follow, because remember, plants are the basis of any ecosystem. All right, now which were dominant in the time of the dinosaurs? So I don't know if you saw the movie Jurassic Park, all right, but they had really huge ferns. So ferns, right, are seedless vascular plants, and our conifers, our gymnosperms, these were the groups dominant during the time of the dinosaurs. So there are big conifers, ginkgo trees, and huge ferns during the time of the dinosaurs. And finally, which group is dominant today? Well, I already told you that, are the angiosperms, the flowering plants. Almost any plant you can name is a flowering plant, an angiosperm. Seriously, any plant that you can think of that's not a moss, not a ginkgo, not a Christmas tree, not a fern, if it's not one of those four, it's going to be a flowering plant. You might think, well, I didn't know grass was a flowering plant. Well, come on. If your yard grows and the grass gets really high, then it forms little flowers at the top. Okay. All right. So the big characteristic of plants is that they are terrestrial. They are adapted to life on land. Remember, so algae are aquatic, so we're just going to go ahead and group algae with kingdom Protista for now. So algae were aquatic, and then the big key characteristic, the new invention, if you will, of the kingdom Plantae is they adapted to life on land. So what are the advantages for plants to living on land as opposed to water? Do you have any hypotheses about this? There's my question mark I was waiting for. All right, well, remember, how do plants get their food? I mean, the whole structure of a fungi is adapted for absorption. Plants photosynthesize. Well, one advantage of being on land is that their access to light is unobstructed, right? If you make your living by photosynthesis, then you better have easy access to the photons. So in water systems, you can have, things get muddy and kicked up. You can have lots of things blocking the sunlight. So there's definitely easier access to photons. Also, the other thing you need for photosynthesis, besides water and light, is carbon dioxide. Now, gas does not dissolve very easily in a liquid, so that sometimes was a limiting factor. But if you're a land plant, you're surrounded by the atmosphere and therefore have access to carbon dioxide. Now, so photosynthesis is the process plants use to make their food, but do you remember the process that plants use to break down the sugar and get the energy out of their food? Well, they use the same process we do, which is cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is the process that breaks down glucose and releases the stored energy. But something that is required in order to do cellular respiration is, once again, oxygen gas, O2. And that's why the oxygen revolution was just so important for life on Earth. Once oxygen gas, O2, became prevalent in the atmosphere, then complex life could have evolved, because you need to do cellular respiration if you're a complex life form, because you need to get lots of energy out of your food, and you need oxygen gas to do cellular respiration. So yes, plants, they not only make their food by photosynthesis, they break down glucose by cellular respiration. And to do this, they need oxygen. And when they are on land, once again, they have easier access to oxygen. Our atmosphere is about over 20%, about 21% oxygen gas, whereas dissolved oxygen in a pond or a creek will not reach that amount at all. So what I want to do in the next video is talk about obstacles that plants had in evolving from an aquatic environment to a terrestrial environment. But first, I want us to really concentrate on a group as the benefits of plants, and so I will have a little activity in the comment box to do just that. So I'll see you in the next video.